Actually, today's session is a little bit of an extension of what we've been doing for the last two sessions. We've been looking at two different, very different models of the macroeconomy. And much of what we're going to do today is really an outgrowth of the second one of the two. Kind of a reminder of where we are in terms of what we've been talking about. We first talked about the classical model. The classical model came to the conclusion that the economy was self-regulating, that the economy would take care of itself, that you really didn't have to intervene in any sense. And then that kind of went out of favor, though it still provides us with some information or some insight into how the macroeconomy works. But the Great Depression proved to us that it wasn't completely self-regulating, that in fact it could encounter problems. That led to what we know as Keynesian theory, although Keynes wasn't the complete final answer to that, his students were. And so last time we looked a little bit at the Keynesian theory and what the Keynesian theory talks about. Now, one way of looking at the difference between these two is that the classical model is much more focused on the supply side, and we're going to see that toward the end of our discussion today, whereas the Keynesian model is much more concerned with the demand side. So, where we've been trying to get to with all of this is to try to recommend some policies that perhaps the government could follow in order to try to help the economy achieve its full potential. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So our subject for today, our topic for today, is fiscal policy. We're interested in talking about what sorts of things might we do that would aid our economy in reaching its goals. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the government's ability to change expenditures and taxation in order to reach macroeconomic goals. Its real official name is discretionary fiscal policy, meaning that it's at our discretion. And what we're really trying to do is to reach the natural real GDP, that is to reach our full potential, and over the long run, in the short run, and then over the long run, to somehow accommodate or cause economic growth. Now, in terms of fiscal policy, basically what you're doing is looking at the budget. And the budget is always the amount of the tax revenues minus the government spending. If the revenues are smaller than the expenditures, then the budget is said to be in deficit. If the revenues are greater than the expenditures, then the budget is said to be in surplus. And if they're equal to expenditures, if the tax revenues are equal to expenditures, then it's in fact balanced. So what we're thinking about here is what sorts of policies would we try to embrace? Would we want to run a budget deficit? Would we want to run a budget surplus? Or would we want to run a balanced budget? Now, the truth of the matter is, prior to the Great Depression, there was only one of these three choices, because the altar that most government officials lived at was the balanced budget altar. In other words, they attempted to never have deficits and never have surpluses, but always balanced. And that's in fact what exasperated or caused the Great Depression to be as bad as it was. Now, according to Keynesian theory, we can actually do this in order to determine the level of real GDP. In other words, we could actually change expenditures or conversely change tax levels in order to achieve the actual real GDP that we're interested in. And we saw that a little bit last time, and we're going to go a little more in depth into it this time. If, as an example, we were in a recession or we have a recessionary gap, then we might pursue expansionary fiscal policy. We could do that one of two ways. We could either increase government expenditures or we could decrease taxation. Typically, in our country at least, the majority of the time what we do is we change government expenditures. When you start changing taxes, it gets a little bit more complex because you have to have some sort of sense about who needs the change and what will be the impact of it, and that varies. But in either case, recessionary gaps or a recessionary period in the business cycle calls for deficit spending. As an example, suppose the current real GDP is 10.5 trillion. The natural real GDP, our potential is 11 trillion. If we know the MPC is 0.8, then we could increase government purchases by 100 billion and reach our goal. In other words, we could move from the 10.5 trillion to the 11 trillion simply by expending $100 billion. And I'll remind you, the way that works is there's actually a multiplier effect. And here's how that works. The multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, or an alternative way of looking at that, it's 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. So it'll be 1 divided by 0.2. So the multiplier is actually 5 in this case, 1 divided by 0.2. So we can take 100 billion and change in expenditure, multiply it by 5, and it will give us 500 billion additional real GDP. That would move us from the 10.5 to the $11 trillion mark. Now again, technically we could do that with a tax cut. The tax cut, however, would have to be larger than 100 billion because some of it will be spent and some of it will be saved. And we'd have to have it very much targeted because some groups in the economy have MPCs of 0.8. Some groups in the economy would have smaller MPCs than 0.8. So we have to be very careful about how we do that from a tax standpoint. It's also the case that from a tax standpoint, oftentimes those effects are not completely known. We don't know exactly what will happen in terms of what people will do in spending that. And I'll remind you that that's an important consideration because the multiplier only works if people end up spending the money that they receive. So it's very important for us to understand how this multiplier is going to work. It's a little simpler if it's an expenditure change because we know that in general, money that comes in as income to people, they end up spending. However, if we change their taxes, sometimes they don't end up spending that. Sometimes they'll decide to pay down their debt, they'll decide to hold on to it, put it into savings or something of that sort. So it's a little easier to do it on the expenditure side than it is on the tax side. By way of what does that look like graph-wise, we'll go back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph that we had before. We're currently at a point that's below Q sub n is the quantity or the real GDP, the natural rate of GDP, and that's where we want to get to. We're currently at the one that's short of that, so what we essentially want to do is to shift aggregate demand. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to shift aggregate demand by changing the government expenditure. And if we do it by just the right amount, then we end up getting to the natural real GDP, or a more up-to-date terminology is the potential real GDP. So what we've done is we've closed a recessionary gap. And this is exactly what Keynes was trying to talk the country into doing during the Great Depression. On the other hand, suppose we have the exact opposite sort of a problem. That is, we have an inflationary gap. We're trying to produce beyond our capacity to produce. It's called inflationary because it has the effect of driving prices up without having any real increase in product. In that case, we want to follow a contractionary fiscal policy, which means we want to reduce government expenditures or increase taxes. Essentially, we want to create a budget surplus. The problem in an inflationary gap is we have too much spending. So what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to wipe out some of that spending. In our case, we can wipe it out by changing government expenditures or the tax level and do it indirectly rather than directly. As an example, using the same figures, the same economy we had a second ago, suppose our actual current real GDP is 11.5 trillion, and we won't need to get to 11 trillion because that's the natural or potential GDP. Same MPC, and we'll really need to do the exact same change. We're trying to accomplish a $500 billion change, and we have a multiplier of 5, so we only need to change government purchases by $100 billion. Same math, only this time it's negatives in front of it instead of positives in front of it. The multiplier is still 5, which is 1 divided by 0.2. And this time we're going in the opposite direction. We're trying to reduce real GDP, so we're going to reduce total expenditures. Again, we could do it with taxes. In other words, we could hike taxes, but we're going to have to hike taxes more than $100 billion to do it. And of course, that's always subject to backlash from the people that vote for you. Opposite sort of phenomena in terms of our graph. We're out beyond the point that we can successfully stay at. We can do that in the short term, but we can't do it in the long term. What it essentially does is drives prices up. So what we attempt to do is move from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, which will reduce the apparent or the actual real GDP and bring us back to where it's possible. Now, there are a whole group of things within our economy which are referred to as automatic stabilizers. And these things are counter-cyclical by their nature. They automatically happen and try to dampen the business cycle. We don't have to do anything about it, but they'll just automatically tend to put us where we want to go to. So it doesn't require any legislation whatsoever. So what sorts of things fall into that category? Well, taxes automatically go up when your income goes up. Transfer payments automatically go up when your income goes up, such as unemployment compensation. When the economy starts slowing, unemployment compensation goes up all by itself. We don't have to do anything at all about it. When the economy starts speeding up, unemployment compensation goes down all by itself. So we have a change in expenditures just by the very nature of those programs. When the economy slows down, more people will retire than what would retire if the economy was going better. They retire rather than being laid off, and so Social Security payments go up. When the economy starts slowing down, that cuts people's incomes, and when their incomes are reduced, then their income tax at least, is reduced, as well as sales tax and others. And these things are called automatic stabilizers. They automatically change and tend to cause the economy to get to the points that we want the economy to get to. So we don't have to do anything to accomplish that. Now these were very important, or these have been very important in certain times. During the 50s, this was one of the reasons that the economy tended to be as stable as it was, is they tended to automatically change and they put a certain amount of brakes on the system so that the system was self-regulating to a certain extent, although that's certainly not what the classicals meant by self-regulating. And so you see that these automatic stabilizers are actually doing some of the work for us and we don't have to do it ourselves. Now there are certain problems with using fiscal policy. The first one is a very important one, and that is it's a political bias. This is very obvious in the U.S. system because since Keynesian theory came into existence in 1936, the federal government's been in deficit almost every year since. Why so? Well, there's lots of political hay to be made by expending money. That is, it's worth your while to go back to a district and say, well, you see the new senior citizen center that I built here? Well, that came from federal money that I brought to you. Or you have a new Air Force airport here, or you have a new naval station here, or whatever. That buys a certain number of votes, and it doesn't cost you anything to do it. So there's a bias toward spending. There's also a bias to not stop spending once it happens. In other words, most programs don't get truly sundowned or done away with. They're not one-time expenditures, they're continuous expenditures. Even infrastructure is a continuous expenditure. You build roads thinking, okay, I can build this and I'm done with that expenditure, but the road has to be maintained. So Once the expenditure happens, there's a political bias in the system to continue that. There is no political bias in the system to reduce expenditures. Everybody's in favor of smaller government, but they're always in favor of smaller government in somebody else's state or somebody else's district. They're not really in favor of smaller government in their own district. They're not willing to do without roads and bridges and Air Force bases and naval stations in their own district, but they think it's a great idea in a district that's far, far away. So there is a political bias, and so essentially Keynesian theory gives politicians a great tool to continue to help themselves be reelected. Second is the so-called crowding out effect. Crowding out effect means that if government expends money, then it has a tendency of crowding out some private spending. If it's paid for through increased taxes, then that cuts consumption expenditures. In other words, if government is expending the money, then they're going to if they finance it through the use of taxes, then they're going to reduce your income. And when they reduce your income, that of course reduces your consumption as well. If on the other hand, as is generally the case, it's paid for by borrowing the money, then it has the effect of raising interest rates, which reduces investment. Primarily investment, but it also reduces consumption as well. It reduces investment because increased interest rates make a lot of projects that otherwise would be undertaken not possible, but it also means that you don't buy the new car as quickly because the interest rate's higher, or you don't get the new house because the interest rate is higher. So government expenditures actually crowd out private expenditures, no matter how they're financed, whether they're financed through taxes or through borrowing, one way or the other, they crowd it out. It's also a problem because of lags, and there are three primary lags that occur. Why can't we do good fiscal policy? Well, there are three lags that come into play here. First off is information lag. We oftentimes are not completely sure of exactly where we are in terms of the business cycle. In fact, some of our definitions actually cause that to be the case. Recession is defined as two successive quarters in which we have a downturn or a negative growth rate for GDP. Well, by its very nature, you're almost a year into the recession before you know for sure you've got a recession. Now, in most cases, we actually have a pretty good idea that we're in recession, but nevertheless, it takes a while for the information to be gathered and for us to know whether it's time to do deficit spending or not. Once we know, then there's a so-called policy lag, and that is it takes a while to actually pass the legislation. The legislation has to come from Congress, it has to come from two different sides of the legislature, it has to be an agreement, it has to pass through committees. Once there's all of that agreement, then it has to be signed, and then it has to be put into motion or actually happen. And that takes a period of time. Sometimes, if the conditions are bad enough, that can happen relatively quickly, that is in a month or less, but generally speaking, it takes quite a while to do, say 3 months to 6 months to actually happen. Once the policy's in place, it takes a while for that multiplier to actually work out. We work our problems out as if the multiplier happened immediately. But remember that the multiplier requires that money be given to people and those people spend it, and then it be given to another group of people and those people spend it, and so forth. And that takes a little while to happen. So while our numbers look like we'll get the $500 billion immediate injection into the economy, that's not really unlikely to happen even if we could do it without any of the other two lags in place. It's often the case also that we might overshoot or undershoot. The truth of the matter is, while we talk about from a theoretical standpoint that we know what the multiplier is, we oftentimes don't know exactly what the multiplier is. And one of the reasons we don't know is because the multiplier is not necessarily stable. People change their buying habits, they change their behavior. And so while we might understand it at one particular point in time, it may change through time. So while we think we've got a multiplier of 5, it might be 6 or it might be 4. This is especially the case when conditions are deteriorating, because people change their spending habits when conditions are deteriorating. When you see other people losing their jobs, you're less likely to spend any income that's coming your way. And so we undershoot where we're trying to get. You know, if you change the MPC for that calculation we did a second ago from spending 80% to spending 70%, suddenly you find you're not reaching the goal that you want to reach. Or if people are feeling really good about what's going on in the economy and are spending 90% instead of 80%, then you find yourself overshooting. Now, this entire focus on the demand side led to a kind of a rebound in the supply side of things. There were a number of people, especially during the early 80s, who said, well, we've been focusing entirely too much attention on the demand side, and where it's led us to is deficit spending, high marginal tax rates. This is continuing over and over. In other words, government is getting too large. It's controlling too much of GDP, and we need to go back to the supply side. And this is sort of the Reagan revolution, in which the focus went back from the demand side to the supply side. It's kind of a neoclassical in a sense. It's a sense of going back to the old classical vision of things. And what that led to was a belief that what we really need to do is to lower marginal tax rates, that in fact taxes were entirely too high and that they were discouraging incentives or discouraging any sort of innovation or anything of that sort. So during the Reagan era, we actually reduced those. And it was based primarily on a thing called the Laffer curve. And the Laffer curve was done by Arthur Laffer, who came up with the idea, who basically said there is an optimal tax rate which will generate the maximum tax revenue. If you go below or above that number, then you're going to lower the actual tax revenues. So it looks something like the following, and you can see that there is an optimal level here. There's an optimal tax rate, which we see at this point, which generates the maximum amount of taxes. If you go above that rate, then you actually reduce the revenues that you receive. And so simply reducing the tax rate would actually generate more revenue. On the other hand, if you go by it, then the same thing happens. The problem here is that we don't know what that optimal level is, and we don't know whether we're above it or below it. And once again, as was the case when we talked about MPCs a second ago, that probably changes through times. People have differing ideas at different points in time as to what is optimal, what is appropriate, or, as they would put it, what is fair. And so we may go by that point and actually reduce it and actually reduce our tax revenues. Is that the case or not? Well, we don't really know. We have no way of knowing that empirically, whether we've got the optimum level or not. But this was used as an argument for why we should lower the marginal tax rate. And in fact, the marginal tax rate was lowered during the Reagan presidency from 70% to the maximum rate from 70% to 28%. So what was the result of that? Well, the result of that was we had some of the highest deficits that we've ever had during that time period, up until modern day experience, in which we've had little bigger ones than that. Now I want to talk for a second about an idea that we hear in the popular press quite frequently, and that is the idea of a balanced budget. Economists do advocate a balanced budget, but what they mean by a balanced budget is a little different from what you hear from most politicians or pundits or people of that sort. Most politicians talk about, when they say balanced budget, what they mean is an annually balanced budget, which means that the budget is balanced every year, year after year. What economists would like to see is a cyclically balanced budget, which means that the budget balances over the business cycle. So when times are good, you would be running surpluses, because that's what Keynesian theory says. When times are poor, you would be running deficits, but you would balance those out. In other words, it would run surpluses during the good times, and those would exactly offset the deficits during the bad times. So you would attempt to balance the budget over the business cycle. Now that's a very difficult sort of a goal to reach because you're not really sure how long the business cycle is. You're not really sure how deep this particular business cycle is going to be. We're back to where we were talking before, that they're not regular and periodic. It'd be nice if they were pretty little sine waves and we could know how high are they going to go and how low are they going to go. Then we could actually come up with a fiscal policy that would allow us to balance over that business cycle. That's unlikely to occur. In other words, you're likely to either run deficits that are too large to be wiped out by the surpluses, or surpluses that are too big and thus don't exactly offset the deficits. However, it is the case that at least in the U.S. economy, we've run nothing but deficits. And so as a result, we haven't made any attempts at all to balance the budget. Now again, most economists would never advocate an annually balanced budget because an annually balanced budget would not allow for any sort of intervention when things are going poorly. We did that one time before and we weren't terribly successful. We refer to that period as the Great Depression, and so most economists are not going to advocate that again. However, most economists would advocate a cyclically balanced budget. Well, that's it for fiscal policy. We'll stop there for this time, and we'll see you next time.